Story 1. The night had been restless, the kind where sleep comes in fragments, broken by strange dreams and an unshakable sense of unease. I wasn't even sure what had woken me at first, a sound, a shift in the air. But as I lay there, blinking into the darkness, I became aware of a low hum. It was the fridge. Something about it felt wrong. The hum was louder than usual, more insistent, like a presence lingering in the quiet. Still groggy, I pushed off the covers and stumbled into the kitchen, my feet cold against the tiled floor. Then I stopped. The fridge door was wide open. The light from inside cast long shadows across the floor, illuminating the contents that had begun to spill out, cartons slightly askew, a bottle of juice teetering at the edge of a shelf. But nothing was missing. Nothing had been taken, or even moved out of place. It was exactly as I had left it the night before. A deep unease coiled in my stomach. I always closed the fridge door securely. It was a habit, muscle memory, part of my routine. And yet, there it stood, gaping open, as if someone had been there, rummaging through it, then leaving in a hurry. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I had been careless. Maybe the door hadn't latched properly. But no matter how I turned the thought over in my mind, it didn't sit right. It felt deliberate. I scanned the kitchen, heart pounding in my ears. Everything else was untouched. The windows were locked. The doors were secure. There were no signs of forced entry. And yet, standing there in the dim glow of the open fridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I shut the door firmly, hearing the suction of the seal as it latched. Then, taking a deep breath, I forced myself to let it go. It was nothing. Just a fluke. But the feeling of wrongness stayed with me. For days, I found myself hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. I double-checked the fridge each time I passed, but it remained closed. Eventually, I started to relax, convincing myself that I had imagined the whole thing. And then, a week later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just open. Something was missing. A single jar of pickles. Nothing else had been disturbed, just that one item, plucked from its place and taken without a trace. My stomach twisted as I stared into the fridge, trying to make sense of it. Someone had been here. Someone had come into my home, opened my fridge, and taken only what they wanted. I locked the fridge that night. It seemed ridiculous, but I had to do something. Even as I slid the lock into place, though, I knew it wasn't enough. Whoever was doing this wasn't breaking in by force. They weren't rifling through drawers or stealing valuables. They were precise, careful, calculated. And they were watching me. Days passed, each one heavier with paranoia. I started locking my bedroom door at night, checking the locks on the windows twice, sometimes 3 times before bed. But no matter what I did, the sensation of being watched never left me. Then, one night, after an exhausting day, I came home and felt it before I even saw it. The air was different. I stepped into the kitchen, and my breath hitched in my throat. The fridge door was open again. But this time, something else was there. A note. It sat neatly on the middle shelf, small and folded. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, my pulse a deafening roar in my ears. Slowly, I unfolded the paper, the weight of its presence making my chest tighten. The message was simple. I know you're watching. I stared at the words, my mind struggling to process them. This wasn't random. This wasn't some harmless prank. This was a message. A warning. The note wasn't signed. No hint of who had left it. No trace of how they had gotten inside. But in that moment, I didn't need a name. I already knew, whoever they were, they had been here before. They had been watching. They knew my habits, my movements, the way I locked my doors at night, the way I checked the fridge every morning. I wanted to scream. To run. But I stood there, paralyzed, the paper clenched in my fist. I was no longer safe. I threw the note away, as if getting rid of it would make it less real. But the truth was clear, I wasn't alone in my own home. Someone had been coming and going as they pleased, leaving no trace except for the unease that had been creeping into my bones for weeks. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By morning, I had made my decision. I packed a bag and left. Staying with a friend seemed like the only option. I couldn't stay there, not when I didn't know when they would come back. Because I knew they would. Whoever had been slipping into my home, opening my fridge, taking only what they wanted, and leaving their quiet little messages. They weren't finished yet. And the next time, I might not be so lucky. Story 2. The night air clung to my skin, thick with exhaustion as I unlocked my front door. A long day at work had drained me, and all I wanted was the comfort of solitude, a warm cup of tea, a book, and the stillness of my home wrapping around me like a cocoon. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of old wood and lavender welcomed me, a quiet reassurance that I was finally where I belonged. The soft jingle of my keys as I tossed them into the bowl by the door was a small, familiar sound, grounding me in routine. Then came the knock. Light, yet insistent. A gentle but deliberate tap that pulled me from my thoughts. I hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was late for visitors. Still, I crossed the room and opened the door, half expecting to find a neighbor needing something. Instead, I was greeted by the familiar, warm face of Mrs. Matthews, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her gentle smile carried the weight of years spent in this neighborhood, watching and knowing more than she ever let on. "Hello, dear," she greeted, her voice kind yet laced with something I couldn't quite place. "I was just wondering, how's your cat doing? I haven't seen it around lately." I blinked. A slow, creeping confusion settled over me. My cat? I didn't own a cat. Never had. Never even considered it. Work consumed too much of my time, a pet was out of the question. "I don't have a cat, Mrs. Matthews." For a brief moment, something flickered across her face, a small, almost imperceptible crack in her smile. But she recovered quickly, nodding with polite amusement. "Oh, my mistake. I could have sworn I saw one playing in your yard a few weeks ago," she said, her voice airy, casual. "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "Maybe you're thinking of someone else." Mrs. Matthews pursed her lips, glancing toward my porch. "It was a black one, right?" A strange, cold sensation crawled up my spine. The description was too specific, too deliberate. And yet, I had no memory of seeing a black cat anywhere near my house. A silent unease settled over me, something that didn't quite make sense, like a puzzle piece jammed into the wrong place. "I'm sure," I said, more firmly this time. "I don't have a cat." She hesitated, then nodded with an apologetic chuckle. "I must be confused, then. Sorry to bother you, dear." I watched her retreat down the sidewalk, her back unnaturally stiff, as if she were waiting for me to call her back and correct myself. When I shut the door, I leaned against it, exhaling slowly. The conversation gnawed at me. Mrs. Matthews was elderly, but not forgetful. She was sharp, always remembering details about everyone on the block. If she believed she had seen something, she wasn't making it up. I tried to push it from my mind. Days passed. I buried myself in work, and the encounter faded into the background of everyday life. Until, one evening, I saw it. A black cat. Sitting perfectly still in the yard across the street. It didn't move, didn't twitch or groom itself. It just sat there, its eyes locked onto my house, unblinking. A heavy weight settled in my chest. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe Mrs. Matthews had seen this cat and simply mistaken it for mine. But then, whose cat was it? No one on the block had pets, at least not that I knew of. The next day, as I took out the trash, I ran into Mrs. Matthews again. She smiled warmly, but this time there was something different in her expression, like she was waiting for me to say something first. Then, in that same casual tone, she asked, "How's your cat doing?" I felt my stomach drop. "Mrs. Matthews," I said, my voice quieter now, measured. "I told you. I don't have a cat." Something in her demeanor shifted, a subtle but undeniable tension tightening her features. Her eyes flickered toward the street, then back at me, like she was expecting something to happen. "Oh, well," she murmured, too quickly. I must have been mistaken again. She turned and walked away before I could say anything else. That night, I left the blinds open just a little, watching the street as the hours crept by. And then, just after midnight, I saw it again. The black cat. This time, it was sitting directly in front of my house. Perfectly still. Staring. Its eyes glowed eerily in the dim streetlight, twin orbs of silent accusation. I held my breath, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It just watched. A feeling of something ancient, something unnatural slithered into my thoughts. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was locked in that silent stare-off, a dreadful certainty forming deep in my bones that if I so much as blinked, something would change. And then I did. And the cat was gone. Vanished, like it had never been there at all. Since that night, I haven't seen it again. I haven't spoken to Mrs. Matthews, either. But something tells me this isn't over. I keep my blinds drawn tight now. And I never leave my door open. Just in case. Story 3. The morning air was crisp, the kind that sent a shiver down your spine even if the temperature wasn't all that low. The sun was barely creeping over the horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and gray as I stepped out of my house. My mind was already occupied with the tasks ahead, deadlines, meetings, the usual weekday routine. But all of that came to a halt the moment I saw it. There, tucked neatly under my windshield wiper, was a slip of paper. At first, I thought it was just another advertisement, the kind that careless passers-by left behind without a second thought. Annoyed, I reached for it, but as soon as I pulled it free, something inside me twisted into a tight, suffocating knot. The note was simple. No name, no signature. Just a single line, typed in a sterile, impersonal font. "Thank you for last night." I stopped breathing for a moment. My hands gripped the paper tightly as my heart pounded against my ribs. Last night? What about last night? I hadn't gone anywhere. I hadn't spoken to anyone. I had stayed home the entire evening, curled up with a book and the low hum of my TV for background noise. There was no party, no dinner, no unexpected visitors. Nothing. And yet, someone had left this note, on my car that I always parked in the same exact spot, as if they had known exactly where to find me. I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. The street was still, empty but for a few parked cars and a distant pedestrian jogging down the sidewalk. No one watching. No one waiting for my reaction. I turned the note over, searching for anything that might hint at who had left it. But the back was blank. Just that one sentence, staring back at me, burrowing into my brain like a splinter I couldn't remove. I shoved the note into my pocket and got into my car, but the uneasy feeling lingered, crawling up my spine like a cold, invisible hand. The entire day passed in a haze of confusion. I went through the motions at work, but my mind refused to let go of the message. Who had left it? And why? Was it a joke? A mistake? Or something else entirely? That night, I tried to push the thought away, to convince myself it was nothing. But the words followed me, whispering in the back of my mind. "Thank you for last night." A joke, I told myself. A misunderstanding. maybe even a prank. But if that was true, why did it feel so personal? The next morning, my pulse quickened as I approached my car. My breath caught in my throat when I saw nothing. No note. No message. For a brief, fleeting moment, relief washed over me. Maybe it really had been some kind of mistake. But then, days later, when I returned home from work, I saw it. Another note. This one was waiting for me beneath my doormat, as if whoever left it had been inside the perimeter of my home, close enough to touch, close enough to know my movements. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The message was different this time. Longer. More direct. You know what happened last night. Don't pretend you don't. A chill crawled through my veins. My skin prickled. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I stared at the words. I didn't know. I didn't remember. I hadn't done anything. Had I? My mind raced through every moment of the past week, searching desperately for something, anything, that might explain what was happening. Had I blacked out? Sleepwalked? Had something happened to me while I slept, something I wasn't even aware of? The thought made my stomach twist in knots. I glanced around my neighborhood, the street eerily silent, shadows stretching unnaturally long under the glow of the streetlights. The world felt too still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I locked the door behind me that night, checking the windows, making sure every latch was secured. But it didn't help. The fear had already slipped inside. The notes never appeared again, but that didn't bring comfort. It only made it worse. Because now, I was left with the gnawing sensation that something had happened, something I couldn't remember. And somewhere out there, someone else knew exactly what it was. And they were waiting for me to figure it out. Story 4. It had been just another exhausting day. By the time I climbed into bed, the city outside my window had settled into a familiar rhythm, cars humming in the distance, the occasional honk, muffled voices fading into the night. I placed my smartwatch on the nightstand, its sleek design a constant companion, glowing softly before dimming to black. The room was quiet. Comfortable. I drifted into sleep effortlessly, letting the weight of the day dissolve into the darkness. Morning came like any other. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds as I reached for my smartwatch to check the time. But instead of the usual display, an alert was waiting for me. Heart rate spike detected, 3 a.m. I frowned. That was strange. I tapped into the heart rate monitor, scrolling through the data. The graph was unsettling, an abrupt, sharp spike, followed by an immediate drop. A surge of panic. Then nothing. Like a moment of pure terror frozen in time. I tried to remember, had I woken up at 3 a.m.? Had I felt something? A nightmare, maybe? But my sleep had been deep, dreamless. No tossing, no turning, no sudden jolts awake. And yet, my body had reacted to something. I checked the time on my phone. 8:03 a.m. The logical part of my brain whispered that it had to be an error. A glitch in the device. But the unease had already sunk its claws into me. This wasn't just data, it was proof. Proof of something happening while I was too unconscious to notice. I spent the day trying to brush it off. I went about my routine, convinced myself it was nothing. But the feeling lingered, a quiet, creeping dread at the edges of my mind. That night, I decided to test it. Before bed, I checked the smartwatch's settings, ensuring everything was normal. No malfunctions. No abnormalities. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take over. But this time, I wasn't just sleeping. I was waiting. 3 a.m. A shiver ran down my spine before I even looked at the clock. The air in the room felt different, thicker, heavier. The silence was deafening, pressing in on my ears. Then, the vibration. A faint tremor from the nightstand, barely audible but unmistakable. My smartwatch. My pulse quickened. I sat up, grabbing the device with clammy fingers. My heart hammered in my chest, and when I glanced at the screen, I felt my stomach drop. Another heart rate spike. But this time, I had been awake. Wide awake. Something had caused it. And I hadn't imagined it. A cold dread coiled in my gut. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned toward the darkness of my room. Shadows stretched along the walls, shifting slightly, as if something had moved just out of sight. My own breathing sounded too loud. Too alone. Then, a second vibration. Not from the watch. My phone screen illuminated on my nightstand. Another notification. Heart rate spike detected, 3 a.m. Warning, unusual pattern detected. The air in the room turned ice cold. I could feel it now, something unseen, something wrong, standing just beyond my line of sight. Watching. I bolted upright, scrambling to turn on the bedside lamp. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't an error. It wasn't stress. It wasn't my imagination. Something had been in the room with me. I threw the smartwatch across the room, the soft thud barely reassuring. My breath came in quick, uneven bursts as I tried to rationalize what had just happened. But deep down, I knew. The next morning, I shoved the smartwatch into a drawer, slamming it shut with more force than necessary. I told myself I wouldn't wear it again. I wouldn't check the data. I wouldn't give it another chance to show me something I wasn't ready to see. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it, the weight of something unseen pressing into the room. The memory of the spike haunted me. Something had been there with me at 3 a.m. Something invisible. Something real. I never wore the smartwatch again. But somehow, I knew it didn't matter. It was still watching. Story 5. I stepped into the restaurant, the familiar hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of silverware filling the air. The warm glow of the lights cast soft shadows on the walls, and the scent of freshly cooked food wrapped around me like a comforting embrace. It had been a long day, and I was looking forward to a quiet meal, just some time to myself, away from the noise of the outside world. The place was only half full, just how I liked it. I placed my order at the counter and chose a seat by the window, where I could watch the world outside move at its usual unhurried pace. The night was crisp, the kind that seeped into your bones if you lingered too long in it. I let out a slow breath, enjoying the contrast between the cozy warmth inside and the chill beyond the glass. That was when I noticed him. At first, it was just a passing glance, a man sitting at a table across the room. I might not have even paid attention to him if not for the way his gaze lingered. He was watching me. Not in the casual, fleeting way strangers sometimes do, but with intent. I shifted in my seat, forcing myself to focus on my meal. But when I glanced up again, he was still looking. Then, to my surprise, he smiled and raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. A strange unease curled in my stomach. There was something unsettling about his expression. It wasn't just a friendly acknowledgement, it felt expectant. Like he was waiting for something. Did I know him? I struggled to place his face, but it was like trying to recall a half-forgotten dream, something that should have been familiar but wasn't quite right. Still, not wanting to be rude, I hesitantly raised my own hand in response, offering a weak wave in return. Maybe he was someone I had met before. A former coworker. An old classmate. But no, the more I studied him, the more certain I became that I had never seen him before in my life. And yet, he was still smiling. Minutes passed. I forced myself to eat, though I could feel his gaze lingering like a weight on my shoulders. Every time I looked up, his eyes were on me. There was something about the way he was watching, like he wasn't just looking, but waiting. By the time I finished my meal, the discomfort had twisted into something closer to fear. I grabbed my bag and stood up, sneaking one last glance in his direction. He had finally returned his attention to his food, his expression unreadable. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Maybe he was just an odd, overly friendly man. I hurried toward the exit, eager to shake off the strange encounter. As soon as I stepped outside, the cold air rushed to meet me, sharp and biting against my skin. I exhaled, letting the tension in my chest loosen. It was fine. He was just a stranger. Nothing to worry about. Then, just as I was about to turn and walk away, I felt it. A presence. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end before my mind could even register why. Slowly, dreadfully, I turned around. And there he was. Standing directly behind me. The man from inside. My breath caught in my throat. He was too close, closer than he should have been. His smile was wider now, stretched just a little too much, as though he was enjoying some private joke at my expense. I hadn't heard the door chime. I hadn't heard footsteps behind me. There had been no sound at all. And yet, he was here. How did you? The words died on my tongue. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. I told you I'd see you later. His voice was calm. Casual. Like this was normal. Like we had spoken before. A cold, icy tendril of fear wrapped around my spine. I took a step back. I don't know you, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the distant hum of the city. Who are you? His expression didn't change. We've met before, he said with an eerie certainty. You just don't remember. Something about the way he said it, so matter-of-factly, so sure, sent a ripple of dread through me. I didn't remember him. I knew I didn't. But somehow, his words filled me with an awful, sinking feeling. I took another step back. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the pavement. He was still watching. Still smiling. Something inside me finally snapped. Leave me alone, I said, my voice stronger this time. And then I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The city seemed too empty as my footsteps echoed down the street. The wind howled through the alleyways, but beneath it, I could almost hear something else. Footsteps that weren't my own. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were shaking as I fumbled with my keys. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling fingers before pressing my back against the wood, struggling to catch my breath. For a long time, I just stood there, listening. Silence. No footsteps. No knocking. Nothing. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there. That somewhere, just out of sight, he was waiting. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the encounter clung to me like a shadow. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. Every time I turned a corner, I braced myself for the sight of that unsettling smile. But I never saw him again. Not in the streets. Not in the restaurant. Not anywhere. To this day, I don't know who he was, or why he was so certain that we had met before. But I do know one thing. If I ever see someone like him again, I won't hesitate. I won't wait. I won't wait. I'll run. Story 6. The night was still when I pulled into the driveway, the streetlights casting long, empty shadows against the pavement. It had been a long day, and all I wanted was the comfort of home. But as I stepped out of my car, something felt off. Then I saw it. The mailbox. The lock dangled open, the small metal clasp unhooked, its door slightly ajar. I froze, my pulse quickening. I always locked it. Always. It was a habit so ingrained I couldn't imagine forgetting. Yet here it was, undone. Forcing myself to breathe, I told myself it was nothing. A mistake. Maybe I had been distracted the last time I checked the mail. That had to be it. I approached cautiously, my fingers trembling as I pulled open the door. The usual assortment of bills and advertisements greeted me, but something was wrong. Every letter had been arranged meticulously. Not just stacked, not just thrown in carelessly like they should have been, but sorted. Organized. The letter from my bank sat neatly at the top, followed by utility bills, personal letters, each placed with precise intent. There were no crumpled corners, no stray envelopes shoved in at an angle. Everything was too perfect. The sight of it sent a slow, crawling dread up my spine. Someone had been in my mailbox. I reached for the first letter, half expecting to find it torn open, my personal information violated, but no. The envelopes were sealed, untouched. Yet the way they had been handled, carefully arranged, felt even worse. It wasn't theft. It was something else. Someone had taken their time. Someone had gone through them, not to steal, but to leave a message. I checked the lock, running my fingers over the mechanism. It was working. It clicked shut just fine. But the unease wouldn't leave me. I scanned the street, searching for anyone, someone, who might have been watching. Nothing. No movement. No figures lurking in the shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here. That they were watching now. I called the post office the next morning. The woman on the line was polite, professional, but there was something in her tone, a pause, an uncertainty, when I told her what had happened. "There's no way anyone would have access to your mailbox without your key," she said. Maybe I had forgotten to lock it. Maybe it was nothing. I wanted to believe that. Days passed. I checked my mailbox obsessively, half dreading, half hoping to see it disturbed again. But everything remained normal. The lock stayed secure. The mail was as I had left it. And then, a week later, it happened again. I pulled into my driveway and felt my stomach drop the moment I laid eyes on it. The lock was undone. The door hung slightly open. I hesitated, my hand hovering just inches from the cold metal before I finally forced myself to look inside. This time, the arrangement was different. Not just neat, but altered. Some envelopes had been flipped. Others turned upside down. My personal letters, ones from friends and family, had been shifted, as if someone had deliberately rearranged them, marking their presence in the subtlest way possible. A slow, suffocating terror crept through my chest. I pulled out a letter from a friend. The back seal was barely disturbed. Just enough to make me question. Had it always been like that? Or had someone opened it, read it, and sealed it back, just enough to go unnoticed? The worst part was the care. The unsettling deliberateness of it all. Not vandalism. Not theft. Something worse. That night, I installed a camera near the mailbox. It was small, barely noticeable, but positioned just right, aimed directly at the lock. I told myself it was just precaution. Just in case. Days passed. I checked the footage each morning with a mix of dread and anticipation. Nothing. The usual cars. The occasional dog walker. Not a single person approached the mailbox. Then, one night, the camera caught something. At exactly 3:23 a.m., a figure appeared. The footage was grainy, the figure shrouded in darkness, but their movements were careful. They moved with precision, stepping soundlessly up to the mailbox. Their hands ghosted over the lock, testing it. Opening it. They didn't rifle through the mail like a thief in a hurry. They sorted it. Piece by piece. Letter by letter. Their fingers traced over each envelope as if they knew them. As if they were familiar. And then, just as slowly, they shut the mailbox and melted back into the shadows. Gone. I watched the footage over and over, my skin cold, my breath shallow. This wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. Whoever this was, they knew my schedule. They knew when I checked my mail. They knew exactly how to avoid being seen. And worst of all, they wanted me to notice. I called the police, my voice barely steady as I explained. An officer arrived, reviewed the footage, took notes. He was serious, professional, but there was nothing they could do. The figure was too obscure. No defining features. No way to identify them. Keep your mailbox locked, the officer advised. Stay vigilant. Vigilant. As if I hadn't already been watching over my shoulder. As if I didn't already feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my back every time I left my house. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening. To the silence. To the creak of the house settling. To the faint rustle of leaves outside. And somewhere in the darkness beyond my window, I knew someone was out there. Waiting. Watching. Getting closer. Story 7. The night had settled deep, wrapping the world outside in a cloak of silence. Inside my dimly lit apartment, the only glow came from my computer screen, casting long shadows across the walls. I had been mindlessly scrolling through emails, my fingers moving on autopilot, when something unusual caught my attention. A small, bright yellow sticky note sat in the dead center of my workspace. Its edges curled slightly, as if it had been there for some time, though I knew that was impossible. I lived alone. No one had been here. And I hadn't left my room all day. I hesitated before picking it up, the paper light in my trembling fingers. The message was short, almost mundane, but its impact hit me like a punch to the gut. You forgot to log out. I stared at the words, my pulse thudding against my ribs. My mind immediately searched for explanations. Maybe I had left the note for myself and just forgotten. But no, that didn't make sense. I hadn't used my laptop since I finished working hours ago. I was meticulous about logging out, I always was. Something cold crawled down my spine, an unshakable sense of being watched. I glanced around the room, but there was no one there. Just silence. Thick. Suffocating. I reached for my mouse, the movement slow, deliberate. The screen had gone dark, but as soon as I nudged the mouse, the display flickered to life. My email inbox was still open. My stomach twisted. That wasn't possible. I knew I had logged out. I was certain. And yet, there it was, my inbox, wide open as if I had never left. My gaze darted to the most recent email, an unread message sitting at the top. The sender's address was unrecognizable, an odd jumble of letters and numbers. My fingers felt numb as I clicked on it. The subject line read, "You missed it." The body contained a single, unsettling sentence. You were logged in. A chill washed over me, an icy grip clenching around my throat. My hands trembled as I reread the words, my mind scrambling for logic where there was none. There was no signature, no sender's name, just those words, words that shouldn't have been there, words that felt like an accusation. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. My body felt wrong, as if my limbs weren't responding properly. I paced the room, my thoughts frantic. The door was locked. I checked it twice, twisting the knob to be sure. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I flinched so hard I nearly dropped it. A new notification. I exhaled shakily and pulled my phone out, half expecting another cryptic message. But the screen was empty, no texts, no missed calls. Nothing. A prank, I told myself. It had to be. A friend messing with me, a weird automated email glitch, or something. But it didn't feel right. The air in the room was heavy, oppressive. It clung to me like static electricity, making my skin prickle. I turned back to my desk, my gaze falling on the sticky note once more. It was still there, untouched, its words burning into my mind. But as I reached for it again, something new caught my eye. A faint impression, barely visible beneath the ink. My breath hitched. I tilted the paper towards the light, squinting as the hidden message revealed itself, the ghostly imprint of letters written beneath the first line. Look behind you. Every muscle in my body locked in place. The words sent an icy spike through my veins. My hands clenched the note so tightly it crumpled in my fingers. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. My ears strained against the silence, listening for something, anything. I turned around. Slowly. The room was empty. But something felt different. The shadows stretched too long, the air too still. My own apartment had become foreign, hostile. Then my phone screen lit up. A missed call. Unknown number. I swallowed hard, dread coiling tight in my stomach. My fingers hovered over the call log before, against every instinct screaming at me, I tapped the number. It rang twice before connecting. Silence. No greeting. No background noise. Just silence stretching into infinity. Hello. My voice barely escaped my lips. Nothing. Then, finally, a sound, a distorted whisper, low and crackling like a voice struggling through static. You forgot to log out. The call cut off. My phone screen blinked back to black. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body rigid with terror. I grabbed my things, shoving my laptop into my bag with shaking hands. I couldn't stay here. Something was wrong, very, very wrong. As I turned to leave, my computer screen flickered again. My heart slammed against my ribs. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been near it. And yet, the display was active, filled with a single line of text, white against a pitch-black background. It's already too late. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter. I could feel something watching me, feel the weight of unseen eyes crawling over my skin. I bolted. The front door swung open, the night air rushing in, cold and sharp against my feverish skin. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. As I stepped outside, the wind howled, carrying a whisper that curled around my ears, soft and knowing. You were never alone. Story 8. It started as an ordinary evening, the kind where exhaustion seeps into your bones and all you want is the comfort of home. I unlocked my door, dropped my bag on the counter, and exhaled. That's when I noticed them, two neatly packed grocery bags sitting just outside my door. At first, I assumed I had placed an order and forgotten about it. It had been a long day, after all. But as I knelt down to inspect the bags, my stomach twisted. Every single item inside was something I regularly bought, my preferred brand of bread, the exact fruits and vegetables I liked, even my favorite snack that most people overlook. The familiarity of it all sent a shiver down my spine. I checked for a receipt, expecting to find some indication of a delivery service, but there was no name, no contact details, nothing. My heart pounded as I pulled out my phone to check for a confirmation email or a forgotten purchase, but there was nothing. No notifications. No record of any transaction. A wave of unease settled over me. I called the grocery store, explaining the situation in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly would somehow summon the unknown sender. The representative on the other end sounded just as puzzled as I was. They checked their records and confirmed that no order had been placed in my name. I hung up, the silence of my apartment pressing in on me. I tried to reason with myself, maybe it was a simple mistake, a neighbor's order left at the wrong door. But no one had knocked. No delivery driver had rung my bell. I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway and knocked on my neighbor's doors, hoping someone could offer an explanation. Each answer was the same, no one had seen or heard anything. The hallway security camera had been broken for months, and without footage, I was left with nothing but the unsettling mystery of how those bags had ended up at my door. For the next few nights, I barely slept. The groceries sat in my kitchen like an unanswered question, an unspoken threat. I wanted to believe it was a harmless mistake, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Someone knew me. Someone knew my habits. And they had gone through the trouble of delivering my exact shopping list without me even realizing it. A week passed. Just as I was starting to push the incident to the back of my mind, something even stranger happened. I was leaving my apartment one morning when I saw a delivery driver pull up outside. He stepped out of his van carrying a bag, the same brand of grocery bag that had been left at my door. I felt my pulse quicken as I watched him approach a nearby apartment. Something clicked. I swallowed my fear and walked over, keeping my tone casual as I asked if he had recently delivered to my apartment. He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, last week. Online order. I asked him who had placed it. His response made my skin crawl. It came through a third-party service. No customer name, just the address. I forced a polite smile and thanked him before quickly retreating to my apartment, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing. Someone had been watching me. Someone had learned what I bought, how often I shop, and then used that knowledge to place an order on my behalf, without me ever knowing. I installed security cameras the next day. It wasn't much, but it was all I could do to feel like I had some control over the situation. I started changing my habits, shopping at different stores, leaving at different times, looking over my shoulder whenever I stepped outside. For weeks, nothing happened. No more deliveries. No strange occurrences. I thought maybe, just maybe, it had stopped. Then, one evening, I found a letter slipped under my door. The handwriting was eerily familiar, the same neat, precise script from the anonymous delivery slip. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the note. Only one sentence was written inside. We know you're watching. We'll be watching you, too. The weight of those words pressed down on me like a vice. Whoever had been behind this wasn't done. I had become their target. And now, I wasn't sure if I could outrun them. Story 9. The cafe hummed with quiet conversations, the clinking of coffee cups, and the rhythmic tapping of laptop keys. I had been lost in my own little world, staring absent-mindedly at the steam rising from my drink, when I noticed it, a phone, sitting on my table. It hadn't been there a moment ago. At first, I assumed someone had left it behind in a rush, but as I reached for it, my breath caught in my throat. The lock screen was unmistakable. It was my face staring back at me. For a moment, I just froze. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no mistaking it, the image was of me, perfectly framed, as if I had set it myself. But I hadn't. And this wasn't my phone. I looked around, searching for anyone who might be looking for it, but no one seemed frantic. No one was checking their pockets or scanning the room. People carried on with their conversations, utterly unaware of the unease creeping up my spine. Slowly, I picked up the phone. The screen lit up at my touch, and a wave of cold dread washed over me. The image, it was a picture of me from months ago, taken during a trip to the beach. I remembered sharing it online, but something was off. The angle was different, slightly tilted, like it had been taken from a distance. I had never seen this exact version before. A cold realization settled in my gut. Someone had taken this photo. Someone had set it as their lock screen. And now, they had left this phone here. For me. My fingers hovered over the screen. I thought about trying to unlock it, but I hesitated. My gut told me this was no accident. Whoever left this phone here, whoever had used my face like this, wanted me to see it. The cafe suddenly felt too small, too crowded, yet at the same time, suffocatingly empty. The time on the screen read 3 p.m. exactly. I considered calling over the staff, letting them deal with it, but something in me refused. A deeper, primal instinct told me that if I let this go now, I might never get answers. So, I waited. Minutes passed. No one came for the phone. No one even glanced in my direction. It was as if this phone, this message, had been left for my eyes only. The thought made my skin crawl. I tapped the screen again, and this time, something new appeared. A message. Just a few words. I'm always watching. My body went rigid. My pulse pounded in my ears. I read the words again and again, trying to convince myself this was some kind of sick joke. But before I could react, the phone buzzed. A new notification. A message from an unknown contact. Against my better judgment, I opened it. You've been waiting for me. Now I'm waiting for you. A sharp, icy dread spread through my chest. How? How did they know? I whipped my head around, scanning the cafe. Every face looked normal, indifferent, engaged in their own little lives. But someone had to be watching me. Someone had to be close. My fingers clenched around the phone. I wanted to throw it, to get it as far away from me as possible, but I couldn't. I was tethered to it, trapped in this moment of terrifying realization. I had to leave. Now. I stood, placing the phone down, trying to act normal. My hands trembled as I flagged down a cafe staff member. Someone left this on my table, I said, my voice unsteady. The barista glanced at the phone, nodding as they reached for it. Thanks, we'll keep it at the counter in case they come back. I gave a tight nod and turned to go. But as I stepped outside, the unease didn't leave me. If anything, it got worse. I forced myself to walk, to breathe, to push the disturbing encounter to the back of my mind. But my body was still on edge. My skin still prickled. Then, just as I reached my front door, my phone buzzed. I hesitated. Slowly, I pulled it out. Another message. Unknown number. I swallowed hard and opened it. It was a picture. A picture of me. Standing outside the cafe. Taken from a distance. My stomach dropped. Beneath the photo was another message. I'll be seeing you again soon. The phone slipped from my fingers. My pulse roared in my ears. Whoever they were never far. And they were just getting started. Story 10. I had just wrapped up an exhausting day at work and was looking forward to nothing more than the quiet, undisturbed solitude of my home. The house was still, bathed in the kind of silence that was supposed to be comforting. It was just me, the dim glow of a single lamp, and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. I made myself a cup of tea, the warmth soothing against my fingers as I curled up in my usual spot on the couch. The world outside was dark, the windows reflecting nothing but the hollow blackness beyond. For the first time all day, I let out a slow breath, allowing myself to unwind. But then, just as I lifted the cup to my lips, I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought I had imagined it, a faint sound just at the edge of my perception. But then it came again. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't from the street, or the neighbors, or even the creak of the house settling. It was above me. In the attic. A chill ran through me. That didn't make sense. There was no way up there. No ladder, no staircase, no trapdoor. The attic was just there, a forgotten space sealed away by solid ceiling. I had lived in this house for months, and not once had I even thought about it. There was no reason to. And yet, someone, or something, was up there. I held my breath, listening. The steps continued. Pacing. Back and forth. Slow. Measured. Like someone was thinking. My hands tightened around the cup, my body rigid with a tension I didn't fully understand. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon, a bird. But no, that wasn't right. These weren't the erratic scrapes or flutters of something small. They were steps. Human steps. I stood up, setting the cup down with a trembling hand. The house suddenly felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath along with me. I moved cautiously toward the hallway, checking every door, every window. All were locked. Nothing was out of place. The house was empty. Except for the footsteps. A deep, unsettling dread coiled around my spine as I walked back to the living room. My gaze lifted instinctively to the ceiling. The footsteps had changed. They were no longer pacing. They were moving, toward me. I swallowed hard, the taste of my own fear bitter on my tongue. I needed to do something. I needed to prove to myself that there was nothing there. That I wasn't losing my mind. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen, my grip unsteady as I made my way to the one part of the house directly beneath the attic. My heart pounded so violently it almost drowned out the sound. Almost. Because I could still hear it. Louder now. Closer. The footsteps pounded against the wood above me, heavy and urgent. My breath hitched as I stared at the ceiling, my skin crawling with a primal, bone-deep terror. And then, they stopped. The silence was worse. I held my breath, my ears straining for any sign of movement. The flashlight trembled in my grip, its beam casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And then, just as I started to convince myself that the worst was over, I heard something else. Not footsteps. Scratching. A slow, deliberate scrape against the walls, just above my head. It moved, dragging from one end of the ceiling to the other, methodical and patient. Something was in there. Something was inside the walls. A sharp, ragged breath escaped my lips before I could stop it. The sound must have given me away because, as if responding, the scratching turned frantic. Nails, or claws, raked violently against the inside of the walls, the sound digging straight into my spine like a hook. I bolted. I didn't think, I just ran. My body moved before my mind could catch up, carrying me back into the living room. I slammed the door behind me, my back pressed against it as though I could somehow keep whatever was in there, in. The house fell silent again. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. The kind that was watching. I stayed there, frozen, for what felt like hours. Listening. Waiting. But nothing came. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, I searched. Every wall, every corner, every inch of the ceiling. I checked for hidden doors, for vents, for anything that could explain what I had heard. But the house remained as it always had been. No entrance. No attic access. No way in, or out. I still live here. I tell myself that it was just my imagination, that there had to be a logical explanation. But some nights, when the world is quiet and the shadows stretch a little too long, I still hear it. The sound of footsteps. Pacing. Waiting. And I know, deep down, that whatever is up there, it hasn't left. It's just waiting for the right moment to make itself known.